Hello and welcome to this video. So before we get started with the actual content, I thought I would just introduce what this is. And this is a segment from a course that I created for the website Udemy, which is an introduction to Git, GitHub, and GitHub Actions, and how these three tools work extremely well together to maintain version control over repositories, and also for CI pipelines and software development teams. These three tools are very useful. So it's a course that introduces these three tools. If you've never worked with them before, or you want to look into them and get an idea of how they work, you can find that course on Udemy. It's entirely free. So I've linked it in the description below. The entire course is also available here on YouTube. I've also linked a course that I created that focuses specifically on GitHub Actions. So if you want to dive deep into GitHub Actions itself, you can find a link to that course in the description as well. So I hope this video will be very helpful for you, and if you find the content is useful, please do like the video and perhaps subscribe to the channel to look for more course content in the future. Hello and welcome to this section all about GitHub Actions. So we've played with Git on our local machine. We've created a repository on GitHub and looked at some of its features and how to use it. Now we're going to focus on GitHub Actions, which is a CI tool, which is excellent for developers who are working with repositories on GitHub. And what we will do in this section is understand how GitHub works, how it functions, what benefits it offers, and look at an example of a GitHub Actions workflow. And then you will build your own GitHub Actions workflow that you will see run in the GitHub UI. And beyond that, we'll make some further changes and additions to see how you can control when workflows run. So let's jump right in. Hello, and welcome to this lecture. So in this session, I'd like to introduce GitHub Actions. We're going to talk a bit about what it is, how it works, some of its components, some of its benefits, and we'll even see an example of a GitHub Actions workflow. This is all so that we have a good idea of what it is before we actually start building our own workflow. So let's get started. So what is GitHub Actions? GitHub Actions is an automation platform that is built into GitHub. It's already in the UI. It allows you to define custom workflows that can build or test, deploy, manage your code, do pretty much anything right from your repository, rather than handling those processes somewhere else, right? It's in the same space as your repository. Think of GitHub Actions as your project's personal assistant. Whether you want to run tests, or if you want to deploy your app, or integrate with some external tool, GitHub Actions can handle pretty much anything for you. So let's look at some key features of GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions is controlled by an event-driven workflow. And what that means is you have a workflow file that has some sort of trigger. It might be a commit, or the creation of a pull request, or the creation of an issue, or maybe it runs on a schedule once every week or something. Whatever that trigger is, when that trigger is met, that workflow will be initiated, and whatever is written in that workflow will happen when that workflow is initiated. Now that workflow is written in YAML, and so our second point there, we have YAML configuration. Those workflows are all written in simple YAML files, and YAML is a relatively easy language to get used to writing, and pretty readable too. Now thirdly, there is an extensive marketplace for actions, and actions are essentially pre-built pieces of code that will handle some process. So if you've got, for example, a few steps you might have to run to log into a particular cloud platform, let's say AWS, you might have an action that has all of that code built into it somewhere, and all you have to do is make use of the action. So your code in your workflow file is a lot less, but behind the scenes it's handling a lot more. Fourth, we have cross-platform support. You can run these workflows in a Linux environment, or a Mac environment, or a Windows environment. GitHub has all of these available, and you can define your workflow to run in whichever one you prefer. And finally, integration. As with so many things GitHub, it works seamlessly with other GitHub features like issues, pull requests, and packages. So why would you use GitHub Actions? If you're needing a CI tool to handle the CI pipelines for your code, GitHub Actions is, I think, a good choice over some of the others that you might be able to use for the following reasons. It's built-in convenience. It's right there in GitHub, so you don't need to integrate with some external tool to run your CI pipelines. It's all in the same place. Secondly, the workflows are very customizable and you can pretty much do anything. It's very easy to use and very flexible. Third, it is possible to build in very useful automation. So if you have a particular task that needs to run, let's say once a week, you can have a workflow that will handle that for you. You don't have to make it run once a week. It will just take care of itself. Fourth, as with so many things GitHub, collaboration. It simplifies CI/CD processes for teams working in the same repository because it's right there. It's easy to see. They can even look at the workflow file. So there's no uncertainty about what the process is that is running when the CI/CD pipeline is up and running. And finally, scalability. Whether you're a solo developer or a large team, GitHub Actions can scale to your needs. So how does GitHub Actions work? Well, we're going to see GitHub Actions in action in a little bit in this section, but essentially GitHub Actions events are managed by a workflow file that contains several important components. So let's look at what those are. Starting with the workflow file itself. It is defined in a .github/workflows folder in your repository. GitHub knows to look there. So if it finds a workflow file there, it knows it's something that has to run as part of GitHub Actions. If you put it somewhere else in your repository, it won't be seen and it won't run. Next, we have the trigger. This will be an event that will start the workflow. So this might be a push to the repository or the creation of a pull request or a schedule or something like that. There are a number of triggers that can be used to start a workflow file. Now within the workflow file, we have jobs. A workflow is made up of one or more jobs that run these tasks. Each job is defined to run in a virtual environment, say like Ubuntu, Linux, or Windows or Mac OS. And then within those jobs, we have steps, which is the fourth point here. Each job contains steps, and the steps are the individual tasks. These are the actual processes or things that will happen in your jobs. The actual things that you want to see happen in your workflow are defined in those steps. And these steps can either run commands like a Linux terminal command, or you can run some sort of pre-built action if that's what you want to do. And finally, then we get to actions themselves. And these really are the building blocks of workflows. Actions are essentially pre-built or pre-written code that saves somewhere else that you can call using the action. And so it only takes a few lines in your workflow file, but the actual code it runs can be quite long in the background. And you can either reuse actions that are already available on the GitHub Marketplace, or you can build your own actions that do something specific that you want to do, save them somewhere, and call them in your workflows. So let's look at a real world example. Imagine you're building some sort of Node.js application. Here's how GitHub Actions might fit into your workflow, into your process. So you might have a workflow that will run whenever there's a push to the repository. It runs tests and it runs lint tests to make sure that the code is good and everything is working as it should. You might have another workflow that runs when a pull request is opened. And when that pull request is opened, this workflow will deploy a test environment to make sure the code works the way it should. And finally, you might have a third workflow that runs when a merge is made to the main branch of the repository. And that final workflow will build and deploy the application to your production environment. So different workflows that will run at different times to handle different parts of your CI process. So here's an example of a very basic workflow. We're going to write one ourselves in a little bit, but here's an idea of one. So we have the name of the workflow on top, and then we have the trigger. So this is defined with the on parameter, and in this case, our trigger is a push. So that means every time a push is made, it's going to trigger the workflow. And in this particular case, it's also defined to only work for the main branch. If you left these two lines out, it would run if any push is made to any branch. In this case, it's only going to run when a push is made to the main branch of the repository. If you had a different branch, say called test, and you push to the test branch, this workflow wouldn't run. It would only run if the push was made to this main branch. So this part here, from the on parameter right down, this is all part of the trigger. Then we have the jobs parameter here, and within the jobs parameter, you would define the name of each job. In this case, we have one job called build, and we have two components here. The first is the runs on parameter. This tells GitHub what type of environment you want to use to run your workflow. In this case, I'm using an Ubuntu Linux environment. And then we have the steps, and within the steps, we have our actual code, the actual process that we want to have happen. In this case, we have a step called checkout, which will basically scan the code in your repository. Then we're setting up a Node.js environment. Then we're installing npm using a terminal command, npm install, and then we're running some tests using an npm test command. If you don't really know what those commands are, that's fine. We're not here to learn how they work. This is just to kind of give you an idea of what a workflow file looks like. So just to refresh the main components, the name of the workflow on top, the trigger, which starts with the on parameter here, the jobs parameter, which is defined one name at a time. Everything within build would be one job, and you can have more than one job. And then within the job, you have the runs on parameter, and then the steps that make up that job. So just to refresh then the key terminology, the workflow is the YAML file that defines the automation, the process that you want to run. The trigger is the event that will start that workflow running. The job is a collection of steps that run in sequence, and the step is a task a step is a task within the job, some process, some command, something that you want to do. And an action is a reusable script or command that performs a specific task. So here are some use cases for GitHub Actions. You can use it, as I already mentioned, as a continuous integration or CI tool to automatically test and build your code to ensure that it works before, for example, you merge it to your main branch. So you could have that test running when you open a pull request, for example. You can also use GitHub Actions for continuous deployment or CD. You can deploy your app to your staging or your production environment when you want to do so, perhaps after you merge to the main branch. You can do code quality checks, so you can run lints, formatting, vulnerability scans, anything to make sure that your code is without any faults and written in the correct way. You can use it for issue management. You can automate responses to issues or pull requests if you want to do so. And finally, notifications. It is possible to send updates or notifications to your team or to yourself via an app like Slack or Microsoft Teams or email or anything like that. And that is a brief introduction to what GitHub Actions is. What we're going to do in the next section is build a workflow and watch it run in the GitHub UI. I'll see you there. Hello and welcome to this lecture. So in this session, you are going to build your first GitHub Actions workflow. We'll put it in the correct place in your repository, and then once we built it and we pushed it to our GitHub repository, we are going to see what it does in the GitHub Actions UI. So let's get started. So I'm in my repository, intro to Git. I'm on the main branch of the repository. We don't need to work on a different branch right now. We will in the next lecture. But for this one, we can just work on the main branch. And what we want to do is add a workflow in the correct place in this repository so that when we push our new workflow to that main branch, it will run that workflow in the GitHub Actions UI on GitHub. So that's what we're going to do now. So in order to do that, I need to add a folder at the root level of this repository. That's the same level as the README file. So in my text editor, I can click this button here, which adds a folder. You'll have to just look at how you add a new folder and make sure you add it at root level. So if I click that, I can add a folder here. And that folder needs to be called .github. Not just GitHub, make sure that the dot is at the beginning. Now, within that GitHub folder, you also need a workflows folder. So in this text editor, I can just add a slash and say workflows. You could also create the one, and then once it's created, then create the other. It depends on how you prefer to do it. But now I've created a .github folder, and within that folder, I've created a workflows folder. Now any workflow I put inside that workflows folder, GitHub will be able to find. So now clicking on that workflows folder, I can use this button to create a new file. And now I can create my workflow file. So you can call this file anything you want. It makes sense for it to be named something which relates to what it does. But for now, we can call it anything. So I'm just going to say first workflow. And then what's really important is .yaml at the end. And if you look at the file, it's currently got these lines here. That's going to change once I add YAML, and it becomes this, which is essentially the GitHub Actions logo. Because GitHub knows, okay, this file, YAML file in the workflows folder, this is going to be a GitHub Actions workflow. So it's clever enough to figure that out. So now we've created our YAML workflow file within the workflows folder, which is within the .github folder. So now it's in the right place. Now we can just create a basic workflow. Now the first thing we would need to add would be the name of the workflow. And I'm going to call it first workflow. And next we want to add the on parameter. This is the trigger that is going to tell GitHub when to run this workflow. Now I want to use a push trigger, and a push trigger essentially means every time a commit or a push is made, then this workflow will run. And you can leave it just like this, and then it would run for if there's any push to any branch in that repository. But I don't want that. I don't want it to run all the time. I want it to only run when a push is made to the main branch of the repository. So in order to do that, I can add the branches parameter and then say main branch. So this way, it will only run when a push is made to the main branch of the repository. You could change this to a different branch. You know, if you have a different branch that you wanted to relate to, you could. Or as I say, if you leave out the branches part, it will be for any branch. But I don't want it to do that. So that is our event trigger. That's what's going to get the workflow running. Now, once we've done that, we can define our jobs. So you'll add the jobs parameter. Now you can have more than one job. You can have several, and those jobs can run at the same time, like in parallel. You can have them run one after the other. It totally depends on how you want the workflow to run. For this demonstration, we're just going to create one job, but it's good for you to know that you can have more than one. So for this job, I'm going to call it job 1. Nice and simple. And the first thing I need to add is the runs on parameter. This tells GitHub what type of environment you want to use for this job. A Linux environment, a Windows environment, or a Mac environment. I want a Linux environment, so I'm going to use the Ubuntu latest runner. And next, I need to define the steps that will be in this job. So what is the actual processes? What is the actual meat and bones of this job? What's going to happen? So I'm going to add 2 steps to this job. And the first step, we're going to make use of an action that already exists in the GitHub Actions Marketplace. And for the second step, we're going to run a terminal command so we can see each one in action. So let's start with the GitHub action that already exists. I'd like to make use of the checkout action. And the checkout action scans the code in your repository, which essentially makes it available to the job. If you don't use this step or this action, the other processes in this job don't have access to your code. They can't see it. So if I go to Google and I type in GitHub Actions Marketplace, we can go to the GitHub Marketplace. And here we have an Actions Marketplace. Now I'm going to type in checkout, if I can spell properly, like that. And here we have this checkout action. And this page can give you all sorts of information about how it works. And there are many things that you can, many inputs that you can use to kind of tailor and customize how the action will work. But for our purposes, we don't need to worry about any of that right now. All we need to do is go to this green dot here where it says use latest version and copy this code here. So this gives us a step name, which is checkout. And then it uses this users parameter to tell GitHub Actions it is using this pre-created GitHub action to run some sort of process. So I'm going to copy this, then jump back to my text editor, and I'm just going to paste it there, and then make sure everything lines up like that. Notice that the name and the users are in line with each other. So we have a checkout step, which is using this checkout action to basically scan our repository. Now that's step number 1. The next step I want to create is one that essentially just runs a terminal command. So I'm going to say print hello world. And now instead of the users parameter which I had here, I'm going to have a run parameter. And so now you can use essentially any type of terminal command that you would use if you were in, let's say, a Linux terminal. So I can say echo hello world, and that's it. So now it will print hello world in the terminal in the GitHub Actions UI. So this is a very simple example of GitHub Actions workflow, right? We have the name of our workflow, we have the on parameter which tells it what type of action or what type of event will kick off the workflow, and we've made it that it's a push but only to the main branch. And then we have our jobs. We have job number 1. This could be any name. It's running on a Linux runner, the Ubuntu latest, which is a Linux runner. And then we have 2 steps defined. We have a checkout step, which uses this checkout action to scan our code. And then we have a run step, which is essentially running a terminal command. So let's save those changes. And now I can push those changes to the main branch and we can see it run. So I'm going to say git add. And then we can commit that, say, let's call it first workflow. Get, and then we can say git push. All right, now it's done. Now let's hop over to the GitHub UI and see what's going on there. Okay, so I'm in the GitHub UI, and if I click on the Actions tab for my repository, here you can see where previously there was nothing. Now we have first workflow. It's already finished because it's very quick. It was very basic workflow. So now we can click on first workflow, and here we can see here is our job, right? So I can click on that job, and here is the steps that were in the job, more than you've defined. Some of it is done by GitHub itself. So it's set up the job that we've defined. It now knows what type of runner it's looking for and so on. Then we had our checkout step where we essentially scanned the code. And finally, we had our hello world step, which let me see if I can make this a little bit smaller. There, now you can see it. So you can see hello world is printed in the terminal. So that is a very basic example of how you can create a workflow file and then have it run in the GitHub Actions UI. And if I go back to my main page of my repository, you'll see now we have this .github workflows folder, and there is our workflow file, just as we pretty much wrote it. So that's a basic example of how you can create that workflow file. In the next lecture, I'd like to change it by using different triggers so that I can show you how you might create a workflow that runs when you create a pull request, and also how you would create one that runs on a schedule, on a particular schedule like once a week or something like that. I will see you there. Hello and welcome to this lecture. So now that we've seen how to build a basic GitHub Actions workflow, I would like to take some time to look at different triggers that you can use to initiate the workflow. And in particular, I want to look at just 2 that are very useful: a pull request trigger and also a schedule trigger. So let's jump in and see how they work. So I'm back in my text editor, I'm in my repository, and this is the workflow that we built in the previous lecture. We just had a checkout step where we checked out our code and then we printed hello world in the terminal. Now, what I want to do in this session is to keep this workflow but make a few changes, but I'm going to keep the push trigger. And then I want to add a second workflow that uses a pull request trigger and a third one that uses a schedule. So because I want to make use of a pull request, I'm going to switch to a new branch, and I haven't created one yet. So I'm going to use the git switch command with -c in order to create it and switch to it. And I'm going to call my branch event triggers. Okay, so now we're working on a different branch. So this workflow, I want to make a few changes to it. The first thing I'd like to do is to actually rename this file, because it's now going to, I wanted to demonstrate a push event. I want to make it very clear which workflow is doing what. So we're going to call it a push YAML, and I'm going to change this to push workflow. And then we don't actually need this checkout step anymore. All I want to do is print that we are being triggered by a push event. So I'm going to say print push event, and here I will say this workflow is triggered by a push to the main branch, like that. Okay, so very basic, very basic workflow. We're just printing something in the terminal when it runs, and it will run when a push is made to the main branch. So now I want to add a new file here, and I want to call this file pull request.yaml, and I want to call the workflow itself the same thing, pull request workflow. And so here our trigger is going to be, oh, I can't spell, pull request. Let me just add jobs here so that the red lines go away. There we go. So now we have a different type of trigger. We have pull request, and you could add more parameters down here. You could tell it a pull request to which branch. For example, if I added branches and then added main like that, then it would only be if a pull request is opened to the main branch of the repository. If you don't have this, it will be if any pull request is open. I'm just going to leave it blank for now, but it's just good for you to know the difference. So let's call this first job that we're going to run our pull request job, like that. And I'm also going to run this on Ubuntu latest. I really can't spell today, so sorry. Look at that. Okay, and our steps, we're just going to have one step, which is going to be print pull request trigger, like that. And we will just run this echo command. This workflow is triggered when a pull request is opened, like that. So very similar to the other workflow, but this one should only run if a pull request is opened and maybe modified. But when the pull request is closed, or if it's merged, then it shouldn't run. Okay, so now we have a push workflow, and now we have a pull request workflow. Next, I'm going to add a schedule workflow. So we'll call this schedule.yaml. And we'll give it the same name, same convention we followed so far. So schedule workflow. And now the trigger will be a schedule. Now, the schedule needs to be defined. You need to tell it. Let me just add jobs here so these lines go away. You need to tell it when it must run. So unlike pull request or push, which will run when those things happen, a push or pull request, schedule needs to know, well, when is the schedule? Is it once a day, once a week, whatever it may be? And we do this using a cron, or cron syntax, cron job syntax. And if you don't know what cron job syntax is, this is something that you can go and look up online. It's essentially a type of code to tell a computer when to do something. It's like giving a computer a time or a day or something that it needs to run a particular thing. And it's defined using numbers and also stars or asterisks. Now, I'm going to use a cron syntax that will run this workflow once every 5 minutes. And to do that, you will do the following. You can have an asterisk followed by a slash and a 5, and then with spaces in between, 4 more of these asterisks, like that. And you can see it's no longer underlined because now it's happy. And this syntax essentially will tell GitHub Actions to run this workflow every 5 minutes once it's been merged to the main branch. It won't happen off of my testing branch. It has to be on the main branch. But once it's there, it will start running every 5 minutes. So let's add our job now. And once again, we'll run this on Ubuntu latest. And for our steps, we're just going to print our schedule trigger. Print our schedule trigger. And here we will echo this workflow runs every 5 minutes on a schedule, like that. If you want to, you can look up online how to change this cron syntax to be something else. Maybe you want to run it every 10 minutes, once a day, once a week. You're more than welcome to change it. I'm going to leave it as every 5 minutes. And there we go. So now we've created 3 new workflows. We've modified the push one that we had. We've added this pull request workflow, which will run when we open a pull request. And finally, we added a schedule workflow, which will run every 5 minutes once we merge to the main branch. So now that all of that is saved, I'm going to add my changes. And then I'm going to commit those changes. Add new workflows. There we go. So now they're all there. And now we can push and we'll use git push. And because I haven't already published this branch, I need to add set upstream. And then origin, and the name of the branch, which is event triggers. And now it's there. So now if we hop over to the GitHub UI, we'll be able to create our pull request. So I'm in the GitHub UI. You can see on the repository main page, we have this little block here. This new branch had recent pushes just 10 seconds ago. So now we can click compare and pull request. And here we could add some information. For now, I'm going to keep it blank just so that we can basically see what happens. So I'm going to create the pull request. And what we should see is there should be a workflow exactly there that pops up now, because this is the workflow that runs when a pull request is created. So now we can click on the Actions tab and go and look at that. And you can see here is our pull request workflow that we added, right? It's a very simple pull request job. And it just prints this workflow is triggered when a pull request is opened. So that workflow ran, but the other one didn't. So if we now go back to our main page of our pull request is all passed. We click merge, and now when we merge it, we should see, if we go back to the Actions tab, that we have a new workflow run here, and this is the push workflow. And I forgot to rename the job for this one, and you can see there it goes. And now we have this workflow. This workflow is triggered by push to the main branch. And if we wait a little bit, we will see the schedule workflow will also run. And as you can see, the schedule job will then run on that schedule. It's a very simple job. Just prints this statement. And of course, we're using this schedule here to tell it when to run. So that's an example of how you can change when a workflow will run depending on the trigger. You can have a workflow that will run when you create a pull request, for example, to run tests to make sure that what you've done doesn't break anything. You can have a workflow that will run when you merge to master. Maybe it deploys your app or your tool to production. And you can have something that runs on a schedule. Maybe it just does regular testing to make sure everything's still okay. Maybe it does some sort of cleanup or a backup or something on a weekly basis or something like that. Just an example of different ways that you can control when workflows will run. Thank you for taking the time to work through this video. I hope that you found it particularly useful. Remember, the entire course is available here on YouTube and also on Udemy, and I've linked the Udemy one in the description below. You can also find my course on GitHub Actions on Udemy if you're interested in diving deeper into GitHub Actions. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video and perhaps subscribing to the channel to look for future updates. Thank you so much for your time, and have a lovely day further.